Hello again. I'm Kay. Welcome to another night here at True Asian Nightmare. If the world has been a little too loud today, if your mind is racing and you just need a quiet place to unplug and forget about everything for a while, you've found it. Just lay back, let out a deep breath, and let my voice guide you through the dark. If you find comfort in these true scary stories, I'd love for you to subscribe and turn on the bell. That way, whenever you need an escape, there will always be a new nightmare waiting for you. Before we step into the shadows, it would mean a lot to me if you could share where you are right now and what time it is on your side of the screen. It's a comforting thought, knowing that someone across the globe might be sharing this exact same late-night quiet with you. So, get as cozy as you can, turn down the lights, and let's start our first story. You know how some people just shouldn't go into business for themselves? Yeah, that's me. I am one of those people. About 7 or 8 years ago, I took basically my entire life savings and decided to build this massive outdoor garden restaurant on a huge vacant plot of land that belonged to my parents out in Thanh Mien, which is this quiet provincial town in Hai Duong. I wasn't some hospitality genius or anything. I just loved drinking beer with my buddies, and I had a decent knack for cooking, so I figured, why the hell not? I poured everything I had into it. I laid down tons of gravel, hauled in these giant bamboo clusters to make it look like a rustic countryside getaway, set up dozens of tables under the fairy lights, the whole 9 yards. And honestly, for the first 3 or 4 months, I really thought I had made it. The place was packed every single night. The smell of grilled meat and the sound of people clinking glasses. It felt like I was printing money. But you know how the honeymoon phase goes. Once the novelty wore off, the reality of my terrible location kicked in. The restaurant was tucked away down this awkward dirt road, not on the main street, so pretty soon, the weekday crowds just completely vanished. I'm talking dead silence from Monday to Friday. We'd get maybe, 5 tables the entire week. It was just me and the staff sitting around, staring at the plastic chairs, swatting mosquitoes, watching my bank account drain. Any rational person would have cut their losses, right? They would have laid off staff or run promotions or just shut it down. But I was stubborn and desperate. Since I was only getting decent traffic on Saturdays and Sundays, I came up with this brilliant, completely screwed up idea to take out another loan from my family and buy a used car to run as a rogue taxi during the week. I found this cheap, 4-door hatchback, an old Hyundai with out-of-province plates. The guy selling it swore up and down that it had a clean record, no crashes, no flood damage, nothing. And it looked fine on the outside, so I bought it on the spot. I should have known right then that you get exactly what you pay for. Literally the day I drove it home, the transmission started slipping and the AC completely died, forcing me to dump another 15 million dong, which is roughly $600. A massive hit for me at the time, just to get the damn thing running. And even then, it was a complete money pit. I was driving around all day burning gas, getting maybe 2 or 3 fares if I was lucky, sometimes coming home with absolutely zero cash after a 12-hour shift. But the mechanical issues were nothing compared to the other stuff. It started on a Sunday. The restaurant was actually somewhat busy, and my sister had brought her kids over to support the place. My niece, Haley, who was maybe 9 or 10 at the time, was running around the gravel lot playing hide-and-seek with the other kids. I had parked the taxi way in the back corner of the property, backed up right against this big bamboo thicket, leaving maybe a 2-foot gap between the rear bumper and the tree trunks. Haley decided that gap was the perfect hiding spot. I was busy in the kitchen, but I heard about all of this later. Apparently, the first time she crouched down behind the trunk, the car suddenly honked. Just a quick sharp beep, and the hazard lights flashed. She got caught immediately. Obviously, she just assumed I had some weird anti-theft sensor on the car, so a few rounds later, she hid there again. This time, she said the engine actually turned over. A thick cloud of exhaust blew right into her face, forcing her to cough and give away her spot. When my sister complained to me about leaving the engine running, I was completely baffled. I reached into my apron and pulled out the only set of keys. They had been in my pocket the entire time. I walked over, unlocked the door, and the dashboard was completely dead. I just muttered some excuse about faulty Korean wiring, because your brain will do anything to rationalize the impossible when you're stressed about money, and I went back to cooking. I don't know why kids are so damn stubborn, but instead of finding a new spot, Haley foolishly snuck right back behind the taxi for a third time. She told me later she was just being super careful not to physically touch the metal bumper so she wouldn't trigger the alarm again. But while she was crouching there, she realized she wasn't alone. She told me later that she peeked through the rear window into the cabin, and she saw a little boy, a bald kid, maybe 4 or 5 years old, standing on the driver's seat. And the thing that still makes me sick to my stomach is what she described next. She said this little kid had his hands wrapped around the steering wheel, and he was violently yanking it back and forth. If you know anything about cars, you know that when the engine is off, the power steering is dead. The wheel locks up. It takes the strength of a grown man to force it to turn even an inch. But Haley swore she saw this tiny kid throwing the wheel left and right like it was a toy, and the heavy front tires of the car were actually grinding into the gravel, turning with his hands. She thought it was her little cousin, Toby, just messing around inside. But then the horn blared. The car physically lurched backward on its own without the engine even running, and the bumper bumped right into her shoulder, knocking her into the dirt. She ran screaming to the dining area, yelling that Toby was trapped inside the suffocating, locked car. I sprinted over there, my heart in my throat, terrified that a kid was suffocating in the heat. I yanked the doors open, checking under the seats, in the trunk, everywhere. But it was completely empty, and when I looked back at the tables, Toby was fast asleep in his mother's arms. He had been there the whole time. Haley started sobbing uncontrollably, refusing to ever step foot near my restaurant again. And me, I brushed it off. I told everyone it was just a shadow, a trick of the fairy lights. I was so deep in my own financial hole that I couldn't afford to believe my car was haunted. But the staff started getting spooked too. The waiters kept whispering about seeing a tiny, fast-moving shadow darting between the empty tables late at night after closing, always hovering near the parking lot where the taxi was kept. I told myself it was just some local street urchin trying to steal leftover food. So to shut everyone up, I went out and bought a dog. Not just any dog. This massive, fully grown black dog. A real guard dog. I chained him up right next to the bamboo thicket, directly facing the front hood of the taxi, figuring his barking would scare off any trespassers. The first couple of nights were fine, but on the third night, I had already gone home to my house a few miles away, leaving my manager, Kyle, to sleep on a cot in the back room to watch the property. At exactly 3:17 a.m., my phone started ringing off the hook. It was Kyle, and he sounded absolutely hysterical. He was demanding that I drive over right that second with the car keys. I was groggy and pissed off, asking him what his problem was, and he just kept screaming that the dog was inside the car. I thought he was out of his mind. I had the only set of keys. The car was manually locked. I drove over there, breaking the speed limit, and when I pulled into the dark lot, I could hear it. The muffled, frantic scratching, and this high-pitched, pathetic whimpering echoing from inside the taxi. I ran over with my flashlight. The heavy metal chain was still securely attached to the tree, but the collar was empty, sitting perfectly unbuckled on the gravel. I shined the light through the car window, and my blood ran cold. The dog was trapped inside the locked cabin, and it was losing its freaking mind. It had completely shredded the synthetic leather of the back seats, tearing the foam out in clumps. There was dog piss and feces smeared all over the windows, the dashboard, the floor mats. The poor animal had literally evacuated its bowels in sheer, unadulterated terror. When I finally fumbled with the keys and popped the door open, the stench of ammonia and hot panic hit me like a physical punch. The dog didn't even run at first. It practically crawled out of the door on its belly, shivering so hard its teeth were chattering, keeping its body pressed flat to the dirt. It scurried about 30 feet away, stopped, and then slowly turned around to stare at the empty car. whining this low, guttural sound that I will never forget. I spent 3 hours scrubbing feces out of the upholstery, cursing my luck, cursing Kyle, cursing the dog, doing everything in my power to avoid asking the one question that mattered. How the hell did a 70-pound dog unbuckle its own collar, unlock a sealed car door, climb inside, and lock it from the inside? I know how crazy this sounds. I really do. I know you're probably thinking I was an idiot for keeping that car. But you have to understand the grip of poverty. When you owe money to everyone you know, your survival instinct overrides your sanity. I couldn't afford to junk the car. I needed it to work. But the entity, whatever was in that vehicle, it hated the dog. A few days later, the staff found the dog whimpering under the rear axle of the taxi. Somehow, the parking brake had disengaged. The car had rolled backward on the flat gravel, and the heavy tire had completely crushed the dog's back leg. It was a sickening, unnatural injury. The dog barely lasted another week. It just stopped eating, laid in the dirt staring at the car, and eventually died right there on the end of its chain, its tongue hanging out in the heat. And I'm not proud of this, but times were desperate. Back then, in some older rural communities in the north, there was still this rugged mindset of never letting any meat go to waste. We butchered it. The kitchen staff cooked it up into a 7-course meal. Looking back now, eating the flesh of an animal that was literally tortured to death by a ghost feels like some kind of sick karma, but at the time, it was just another Tuesday. After the dog died, the bad luck just completely suffocated me. The restaurant went from 5 tables a week to 0. Literally 0. I would sit there on a Saturday night, prime time, and not a single soul would walk through the gates. I was forced to drive the taxi 7 days a week just to pay the interest on my loans. But the car was a weapon. I'd be driving down a straight, empty road, and the steering wheel would physically jerk out of my hands, just violently snap to the right, forcing me into a ditch. I had to pay out of pocket to fix a fence I destroyed. I'd get pulled over by traffic cops who swore I didn't use my turn signals, even though I was sitting there with the blinker clicking loudly in the cabin, completely invisible to the outside world. I woke up one morning to find all 4 tires slashed. No, not slashed, just completely deflated. The valves had been unscrewed and laid neatly on the pavement. I was losing my mind. My wife was threatening to take the kids and leave. My parents were furious that I had squandered their land. I was a cornered animal. So, I resorted to the most desperate tactic in the taxi playbook, the graveyard shift at the provincial hospital. I figured I could park outside the emergency room at 1 or 2 a.m., waiting for those desperate, high-paying fares, people taking bodies home or rushing back to a village in the middle of the night. You just recline your seat, crack the window, and pray for blind luck. The first 2 nights out there were pure psychological torture. I was exhausted, hovering in that weird space between sleep and waking when I kept hearing this sound. Heh, heh, heh. Just a soft, breathy giggle coming from the back seat. I'd snap awake, heart hammering against my ribs, throwing my arm back to turn on the dome light, but there was nothing. Just the shredded foam of the seats staring back at me. I kept telling myself it was the wind blowing through the cracked window, or just my brain misfiring from the stress. But then came the 3rd night. It was pushing 3 a.m. I hadn't gotten a single fare. I had just bought a cheap bowl of midnight noodles from a street cart, eaten it on the hood of the car, and climbed back into the driver's seat. I cranked the seat all the way back so I was practically lying down, staring up at the yellow glow of the streetlights filtering through the windshield. I had a wooden toothpick in my mouth, just idly picking at my teeth, wallowing in my own misery. The hospital parking lot was dead quiet, until the temperature in the cabin just plummeted like a meat freezer. And right as I was hit by this thick, nauseating stench of old copper and wet garbage, I heard this wet, bubbling choking sound, almost like someone gargling through a mouthful of thick sludge, coming directly from the passenger seat right next to my ear. I froze. My lungs completely locked up. The toothpick slipped out of my numb lips and fell onto my chest. I didn't want to look. Every single survival instinct I had screaming at me to close my eyes, to open the door and run blindly. But human morbid curiosity is a curse. I slowly turned my head to the right, toward the passenger seat. He was sitting right there. It was the little bald boy Haley had seen. But he wasn't a normal kid. His clothes were shredded, soaked in this thick blackish red sludge, and the entire right side of his skull was just gone. Caved in. A mess of bone and dark tissue completely flattening his profile. He was sitting cross-legged on the seat, his unbroken eye staring completely unblinking directly into my face. And he just kept letting out that gargling, choking laugh, the sound bubbling up through the blood in his throat. I didn't even scream. I just completely lost my mind. I threw my entire body weight against the driver's side door, practically tumbling out onto the concrete pavement, scraping my hands raw. I scrambled to my feet and just ran. I abandoned the car with the keys in the ignition, the door wide open, and sprinted blindly across the dark street until I collapsed near a 24-hour rice stall, hyperventilating so hard I thought I was having a heart attack. The vendor thought I was a junkie having a bad trip. I didn't care. I called my wife from a payphone, crying like a child, and made her pick me up. I never drove that car again. I sent Kyle to retrieve it the next morning in the daylight. I spent the next few days aggressively tracking down the original owner, demanding to know the truth, and eventually, a relative of his broke down and confessed. A year prior, the previous owner had been driving through a busy market street. A little 4-year-old boy, overly hyper, had violently ripped his hand away from his mother's grip and sprinted directly out into the traffic. The car didn't even have time to brake. It didn't hit him with the bumper. The kid slipped perfectly under the chassis, and the heavy front passenger tire rolled directly over his skull. Because there were no dents on the bodywork, the owner managed to scrub the undercarriage, bribe a mechanic, and sell it off out of province with a clean record to some unsuspecting idiot. Me. I was the idiot. I sold the car to a scrap dealer for a fraction of what I paid. I took a massive financial loss, but I felt this overwhelming wave of relief watching that cursed piece of metal get towed away. I thought the nightmare was over. I thought my life could finally go back to normal. But that's the thing about the paranormal that completely shatters any logic I ever had. You'd think selling the object would get rid of the attachment, right? Nope. The car was gone, but the ghost of that little boy stayed behind. It was like a parasite had detached itself from the vehicle and burrowed straight into the soil of my family's land. The restaurant staff started quitting one by one. They were terrified. They kept seeing the shadow of a mangled little boy sprinting through the bamboo bushes in the garden, running between the empty tables in the dead of night, giggling in the dark. It ruined everything. The restaurant officially went bankrupt. I had to sell off the commercial fridges, the plastic tables, the fairy lights, everything for pennies on the dollar. My wife screamed at me for ruining our finances. My parents disowned me for a year, furious that I had turned their valuable real estate into literal dead space. No one in town would eat there, and sure as hell, no one would buy the land. It became known as the local ghost lot. It took years of financial ruin and a professional exorcism by a high-ranking monk to finally clear the land enough so my parents could sell it to an out-of-town developer. They gave me a tiny sliver of the profit, barely enough to pay off my lingering debts. To this day, if we're at a family gathering and some oblivious relative jokingly suggests I should open another restaurant or start driving a taxi again, I see absolute red. I will literally flip the table and scream at them until my throat bleeds. They think it's just my bruised ego from a failed business. They don't understand that they are casually joking about the entity that dismantled my sanity piece by piece. And honestly, it makes my stomach drop every time I think about who bought that car from the scrap dealer. Did they fix it up? Is someone else driving it right now? If you take anything away from my family's total collapse, let it be this. If someone is offering you a used car for a price that seems too good to be true, and it has a spotless record, do yourself a favor and walk away. I spent my college years in Hue, and I had this whole system figured out for going back to my hometown in Quang Tri. Always travel during the day. That was my strict rule. You leave around noon. You get there by 4 or 5 p.m. No stress at all. But life happens, right? It was a few months post-TET, and my workload was just insane. I got stuck on campus and missed my usual afternoon ride. Ended up having to buy a ticket for the 7 p.m. bus. By the time we crossed over into Quang Tri, it was dead night, maybe pushing 9 p.m. And I wasn't even home yet. I still had to stand out there and wait for a second, smaller local bus to drag me back into my district. And when I say waiting, I don't mean sitting on a nice bench inside some brightly lit terminal building with security guards and vending machines. No, the drop-off for the main intercity buses was just this chaotic intersection, and to catch my local transit line, I had to walk about, maybe 300 meters down Highway 1A, just trudging along the dirt shoulder of the main national highway in the pitch black. Highway 1A at night is an entirely different beast than it is during the day. During the day, it's just dusty and loud, but at night, it's this massive, roaring artery of heavy machinery. You've got these massive 18-wheelers and shipping container trucks just barreling down the asphalt at terrifying speeds. Every time one passes, the draft literally tries to suck you into the road, and the ground vibrates so hard you can feel it in your teeth. So, I'm dragging my duffel bag down the dirt shoulder, completely exhausted, just drained from the week of classes. My clothes are sticking to my back from the humidity, and all I want to do is collapse into my own bed. I finally get to the designated bus stop, and calling it a stop is being incredibly generous. There was no shelter, no bench. It was literally just a rusty metal pole jammed into the dirt with a faded chipped sign on top, indicating it was a transit pickup point. The only illumination was this single, sickly orange sodium street lamp hanging from a concrete pillar a little ways down, casting these long, distorted shadows across the gravel. I dropped my bag at the base of the pole, let out this huge sigh, and just kind of slumped my shoulders, settling in for the wait. I figured, okay, it's past 8:30. These local buses usually run every 15 minutes or so. I shouldn't be out here long. I was looking down at my phone, trying to see if I had any signal. When I realized I wasn't alone, I glanced over to my right, and maybe, I'd say about 10 or 12 feet away from me, just at the edge of the orange light pool, there was a guy. He was just a young guy, maybe around my age, looking like any standard guy heading back to his hometown. He had on this dark baseball cap, pulled down pretty low, a faded striped button-down shirt that looked a little too big for him, some dusty jeans, and a pair of cheap rubber sandals. He had a bulky canvas backpack resting in the dirt right next to him. But the thing was, he wasn't standing. He was squatting in that very typical, flat-footed crouch, his knees splayed out wide, and he was eating. He had this whole loaf of banh mi, just the plain, crusty baguette, and he was tearing into it. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, people get hungry, whatever. I just kind of gave him that standard, tight-lipped nod you give strangers at night to acknowledge their existence without inviting a conversation, but he didn't look up. He just kept staring straight ahead at the asphalt, completely locked in on tearing bites out of this bread. I looked away, staring down the long, empty stretch of the highway, waiting for the familiar headlights of my bus. But the longer we waited there in the humid night, the more the sound of his eating started to get to me. You have to understand the acoustic environment out there. Every few minutes, a massive truck would roar past, drowning out the whole world in this deafening rumble of diesel engines and rattling metal. But in the quiet pockets between the trucks, all I could hear was him. He wasn't chewing normally. He was eating with this desperate, animalistic intensity. I could hear the dry, raspy tearing of the bread crust, followed by this really wet, heavy smacking sound as he chewed with his mouth open. It was this rhythmic tear, crunch, smack, 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 just echoing in the humid air. I remember shifting my weight, feeling this weird prickle of annoyance, and, I don't know, a tiny bit of unease. at the base of my neck. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that the guy was probably just exhausted from a long shift at some factory, starving, just trying to get some carbs in his system before he got home. I actively avoided looking at him again because I didn't want to be the weirdo staring at a guy eating his dinner in the dirt. About 10 minutes go by. Finally, way down the highway, I see them. The distinctive, wide-set headlights of the local transit bus cutting through the dark. My mood instantly lifted. Oh, finally, I thought. I grabbed the handle of my duffel bag, stepped right up to the edge of the asphalt, and raised my arm high. I started doing the standard wave, flagging them down clearly. The bus was moving pretty fast, kicking up dust, but as it got closer, I could clearly see the route number glowing in the windshield. It was my bus. I took a half step forward, keeping my arm raised, making absolute sure the driver saw me. The bus closed the distance. 50 yards, 30 yards, 10 yards. It didn't slow down. It didn't put its turn signal on. It didn't veer toward the shoulder. It just blew right past me. The wall of hot, exhaust-smelling air smacked me in the face, making me stumble back a step. But here's the weird part. As the cab of the bus passed me, literally as the driver's window was parallel to me, I heard the sharp hiss of the air brakes. The driver tapped the brakes hard, causing the heavy chassis of the bus to lurch down for a split second, the tires screeching slightly on the pavement. It was the exact reaction of a driver who just got startled, like he hadn't seen me standing there, until he was right on top of me. But instead of pulling over a few yards down, the engine revved back up, the brake lights clicked off, and the bus just kept hauling down the highway, leaving me standing there in a cloud of swirling dust. I dropped my arm, completely bewildered. I muttered some choice words under my breath, just pure frustration. I looked down at my shirt. It was a lighter color, not exactly camouflage. I was standing directly under the street lamp. I was right next to the official transit pole. How in the hell did he not see me until the last possible second? I glanced over at the guy eating the bread. He hadn't flinched. The bus had just blasted past us, kicking up gravel, and he was still just squatting there, staring at the road, rhythmically chewing his banh mi. Whatever. It's fine. Maybe the driver was off his shift, or maybe he was running late and didn't want to stop for one passenger. I checked my phone. 8:47 p.m. The next one would be along soon. I stood there for another 10, maybe 15 minutes. The quiet between the semi-trucks was starting to feel really heavy. The wet chewing sounds from my right were starting to actually make my stomach turn a little bit. Just this grating, repetitive noise that I couldn't block out. Then, headlights again. Another transit bus, same route number. This time, I wasn't taking any chances. I picked up my bag, stepped practically onto the white line of the highway, and waved my arm aggressively. I was practically doing jumping jacks out there. The bus approached. It was going fast again. I held my ground, waving, making aggressive eye contact with the giant windshield. Once again, it didn't slow down. It kept its trajectory right down the middle of the lane. As it got within a few yards, the driver slammed on the brakes again. Hiss! The bus violently dipped, the tires barking against the asphalt. They had definitely seen me, but way too late. They were already overshooting the stop. But this time, the folding doors in the middle of the bus were propped open to let the air in, and the assistant, the fare collector guy, was hanging onto the handrail, leaning out. As the bus carried its momentum past me, the assistant glared down at me, his face twisted in annoyance, and he just screamed over the engine noise. "Stand somewhere else. Who the hell is gonna see you standing right there to pick you up?" And before I could even process what he said, the driver hit the gas, and the bus roared off into the night. I just stood there, my arms still half raised, my jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. Are you kidding me? I was absolutely livid. I yelled out into the empty highway, asking the universe what the hell his problem was. I was standing exactly where I was supposed to be. I was right at the designated pole. I wasn't hiding in the bushes. The unfairness of it just spiked my blood pressure. I was so incredibly tired, so desperate to get home, and these drivers were treating me like I was doing something wrong. I looked down at my wallet. I had exactly 35,000 dong left in there, barely $2. That wasn't even enough to negotiate a ride with a sketchy motorcycle taxi at this hour, even if one happened to drive by. If I didn't catch a bus, I was going to be walking for hours in the dark. I was on the verge of tears, not from sadness, but from that pure, helpless frustration you get when you're exhausted and broke. I wiped my face, took a deep breath, and prepared for the next one. It took almost 20 minutes this time. The night was getting colder, the dampness seeping into my clothes. The guy to my right was still there, still chewing. I was so hyper-focused on my own misery I completely tuned him out. Bus number 3 appeared on the horizon. I told myself, I am getting on this freaking bus if I have to throw my body onto the hood. As it got closer, I stepped entirely off the dirt shoulder and planted my feet right in the right-hand lane of the highway. I started waving my arms wildly, like a guy trying to flag down a rescue helicopter on a desert island. I was not going to let him pass. The driver saw me. He actually flashed his brights and started to decelerate, veering the heavy vehicle toward the shoulder to pull in. Relief washed over me. Finally. But right at that exact second, this massive multi-ton shipping container truck came, hurtling up from behind the bus in the passing lane. The truck driver must have been impatient or sleepy, because he swerved into the right lane way too early, violently cutting the bus off. The bus driver had to jerk the steering wheel to the left to avoid getting clipped by the truck's massive rear trailer. The horn blasted, this deafening, terrifying blast of air that shook my ribs. Because of the evasive maneuver, the bus completely lost its angle to pull over. The driver had no choice but to gun the engine and merge back into traffic behind the truck to avoid an accident. I watched the red taillights of the third bus shrink into the darkness. It was gone. I stumbled back onto the dirt shoulder, my knees literally shaking from the adrenaline of the near miss with the truck and the crushing weight of reality. I dropped my bag into the dirt and just let out this pathetic, broken sound. I felt completely defeated. I was stranded. It was past 9:30 p.m. The buses might stop running soon. I was going to have to sleep in the dirt on the side of Highway 1A. I was standing there, staring at the ground, trying to figure out if I could somehow walk to the main terminal and beg someone for a ride, when I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me. I spun around. Walking toward me from the direction of the main station compound was this older woman. She was wearing the standard-issue blue uniform of the transit workers, probably a janitor or a ticketing clerk finishing her late shift. But the weird thing was, she wasn't carrying a flashlight or a bag. She was holding 3 lit incense sticks between her palms. The glowing red cherries at the tips cut through the gloom, and a thick ribbon of pungent sandalwood smoke trailed over her shoulder. She walked up to me, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Son," she asked, her voice raspy, "what are you doing standing out here so late?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. I told her I was just trying to catch the local transit line back to my district. I explained how 3 separate buses had just blown right past me, how the last one almost got hit by a truck, and how the assistant on the second bus actually yelled at me for where I was standing. The transit lady stopped walking. The expression on her face shifted from confusion to this profound, heavy exasperation. She shook her head, looking at me like I was a toddler playing on a train track. For crying out loud, she sighed, waving her hand at the space next to me. "Why in the world are you standing right next to the shrine? Of course they can't see you. You need to back up at least 30 meters down the road if you want anyone to pick you up." I froze. My brain completely stalled out. I slowly turned my head to the right, pointing my finger toward the spot 10 feet away. I opened my mouth to tell her that I wasn't standing next to a shrine. I was standing next to the guy in the striped shirt. The guy who had been sitting there, aggressively chewing a loaf of banh mi for the last 45 minutes. But when I looked at the spot under the orange street lamp, the guy was gone. There was no backpack, no dusty sandals, no guy squatting in the dirt. Right in the exact physical space where he had been sitting, occupying the exact same volume of air, was a concrete spirit shrine. It was small, maybe waist high, painted a faded yellow. resting on a concrete pedestal. It looked relatively new, but covered in a layer of highway dust. My stomach plummeted. The blood rushed out of my face so fast I felt dizzy. A wave of pure ice-cold electricity shot down my spine, paralyzing my legs. I had walked this route a dozen times during the day over the past 2 years. I knew every pothole, every signpost. There had never been a shrine here. Never. I stood there, hyperventilating slightly, unable to take my eyes off the concrete structure. The older woman didn't seem to notice my absolute mental breakdown. She just walked right past me, stepping up to the little shrine. She bowed her head a few times, planted the 3 smoking incense sticks into a little sand-filled urn at the front, and then she reached into the deep pocket of her blue uniform jacket. She pulled out a small, clear plastic bag. Inside it was a completely fresh, unbitten loaf of crusty banh. She carefully unwrapped it and placed the bread right onto the center of the shrine's altar, right next to the burning incense. My mind was screaming, "Holy fucking shit." My hands started shaking violently. The sound of that wet, heavy chewing, smack, 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 suddenly echoed in my memory so loudly I thought my eardrums were going to burst. I realized, with a sickening jolt of absolute horror, why the guy hadn't acknowledged me, why he hadn't reacted to the buses, why he was just staring at the asphalt. The transit lady stepped back, brushing the dust off her hands. "I keep telling the bosses they need to move this transit pole." She grumbled, almost talking to herself, but loud enough for me to hear. "It's dangerous. You stand right here, you get completely hidden. It's like a blind spot. The drivers, they're going 50 miles an hour. By the time they break through the haze and actually see a living person standing here, they're only 5 meters away. They have to slam on the brakes, almost cause a pileup, and they just have to keep driving." She turned to look at me, her eyes dead serious. "People around here know," she said quietly. "He covers their eyes." I couldn't speak. I just pointed a trembling finger at the fresh loaf of bread sitting on the concrete. She looked at the bread, then back at me, her expression softening into something resembling pity. "It was right after the New Year," she explained, her voice dropping into a hushed, respectful tone. "The 8th day of Tet. There was a young guy out here, headed up to Hugh for a new factory job, waiting for the bus right where you were standing. He was sitting on his bag, eating his dinner, a plain loaf of bread." She pointed a finger out toward the dark asphalt of the passing lane. "Container truck," she said grimly. "Driver was doing a 30-hour haul. Fell asleep at the wheel. The truck drifted right off the pavement and plowed straight through the shoulder. Didn't even touch the brakes." I felt bile rising in the back of my throat. I couldn't look away from the shrine. "Killed him instantly," the older woman continued, her words painting a picture I desperately didn't want to see. "When the paramedics finally got out here, it was awful. They said he didn't even know what hit him. He still had the bread in his hands. He had just taken a bite. The medics said when they tried to move him, his mouth was just pouring out blood, thick with all the chewed up pieces of bread he hadn't even swallowed yet." My vision swam. The wet, rhythmic smacking sound I had been listening to for 45 minutes wasn't just someone eating. It was the sound of a hungry ghost, trapped in a violent loop, desperately trying to finish his last meal, in the exact spot his life was violently ripped away. "He died hungry," the transit lady whispered, looking at the glowing incense. "A sudden, hungry death. So the locals built this shrine to appease him. Anyone who knows the story brings a fresh loaf of bread when they pass by, hoping he'll bless them with safe travels. But if you stand right next to him while you wait, he doesn't like sharing the space. He hides you from the road." She patted my shoulder, pulling me out of my paralyzing shock. "Back up down the road, son. Right now. The last bus of the night comes in 5 minutes." I didn't say a single word. I grabbed my duffel bag and practically sprinted backward, dragging my feet through the dirt until I was a good 40 meters away from the pole, away from the pool of orange light, away from the shrine. I stood in the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs, my eyes locked onto that little concrete box. I didn't blink. I was terrified that if I took my eyes off it, the guy in the striped shirt would be squatting there again. 5 minutes later, the final local transit bus of the night came over the horizon. I raised my arm. The bus saw me from a mile away. The turn signal blinked on. The air brakes hissed smoothly, and the heavy vehicle pulled gracefully onto the shoulder, stopping right in front of me. The doors hissed open. I scrambled up the steps, paid my fare, and collapsed into a seat in the very back row. As the bus accelerated back onto the highway, I pressed my face against the cold glass of the window, looking back at the transit pole. The orange street lamp cast a sickly glow over the dirt. The pole was empty, but sitting right there on the concrete altar, illuminated by the red cherries of the burning incense, was the fresh loaf of bread. You bet your life I never traveled at night after that. From then on, I timed my trips perfectly, so I'd reach that exact stretch of the highway by 4 or 5 p.m. at the latest. When I went back a few months later, I saw that the transportation guys actually listened to that station worker. The metal bus stop sign had been dug up and bolted back into the ground about 15 meters further away. But the shrine, it didn't move. And every time I looked out the window as we drove by, I always saw a completely untouched, fresh piece of bread sitting on the altar. Okay, so this happened back when I was a personal driver for a corporate guy in District 1. I used to cycle miles from Funduan just to get to work, and honestly, the boss felt bad for me. He started letting me bring his car home, which was a huge deal for me back then. Anyway, we had this early morning trip scheduled for Long An. The client meeting was at 7 a.m., meaning I had to be rolling out by 4. I explicitly told my wife, hey, get me up at 3:30. But you know how it is. She gets nervous about me being late, so she ended up waking my ass up an entire hour early, at 2:30 a.m. I had no idea I was an hour early. I remember stumbling out of bed, the concrete floor freezing against my bare feet, and my brain was just absolute mush. I didn't bother checking the wall clock because, honestly, when you're the sole provider for your family and your job depends on driving a wealthy executive around in a pristine Camry, which, by the way, was worth an absolute fortune back then, easily tens of thousands of bucks, something a guy like me couldn't afford in 3 lifetimes. You don't question the alarm. You just move. I stood in the cramped, dimly lit bathroom of our tiny house, splashing freezing tap water onto my face, aggressively scrubbing my teeth with this cheap, chalky toothpaste, just trying to force my eyes to stay open. The whole house was dead quiet, save for the hum of our old ceiling fan. I threw on my uniform, grabbed the car keys, and slipped out the front door, shivering a bit as the heavy, humid night air of Saigon hit me. I fired up the engine, the low purr of it echoing a little too loudly in the narrow alleyway, and slowly navigated my way out onto the main roads. Now, usually, Saigon is a city that refuses to sleep. Even at 3 or 4 in the morning, you'd expect to see life. The route from Funwan towards District 1 is a long, straight shot down Hai Ba Trung Street, and it's normally peppered with early risers. You'd usually see these older women setting up their little carts, the smell of steaming, sticky rice cutting through the exhaust fumes, or you'd see the newspaper vendors, especially the newspaper folks, sitting cross-legged under the street lamps, spreading their stacks of damp paper out on the pavement to sort them before the morning rush. But this night, it was a complete void. I remember driving block after block, the yellow glow of the streetlights washing over the hood of the car, and just feeling this creeping sense of isolation. There wasn't a single cart, not a single vendor, just me, gripping the cold steering wheel, staring out at empty sidewalks. I kept my foot light on the gas, strictly obeying every single traffic law, because my boss would absolutely skin me alive if I got a ticket in his luxury vehicle. I hit one red light, waited it out in the dead silence. Hit another one, waited it out. My brain was just doing that numb, rambling thing it does when you're sleep deprived, complaining internally about how unfair it was that I was awake while the rest of the city was comfortably buried under their blankets. And then, I reached the intersection of Hai Ba Trung and Vo Ti Sao. If you know the area, you know that right at that corner sits Levantam Park. It's a massive, sprawling green space now, but back in the day, before 75, it was the Mac Din Chi Cemetery, a massive burial ground strictly reserved for high-ranking politicians and the ultra-wealthy. They eventually relocated the graves to build the park, but anyone who grew up around there knows the soil is heavy with history. Anyway, as I rolled up to the red light at that specific intersection, I realized something was wrong with the lighting. The street lamps lining the park side were completely dead. It wasn't like they flickered and went out as I approached. They were just pitch black, swallowing the entire corner in this thick, unnatural darkness. The only illumination was the harsh red glare of the traffic light reflecting off the asphalt in front of me. I was just sitting there, the engine idling, tapping my fingers against the steering wheel, trying to peer into the dark tree line of the park, wondering if maybe a transformer blew or if the city just cut the power early. The silence inside the cabin was absolute until I heard this deliberate, hollow tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. Almost like a knuckle rapping directly against the passenger side window, and I swear my heart did a miserable little flip in my chest. I slowly turned my head, squinting through the glass, and there, standing just inches from my car door, was a man. My immediate reaction was just annoyance mixed with a spike of anxiety. I automatically assessed him as a vagrant or maybe a drunk who had wandered out of an alley. He was wearing this really grimy, faded bucket hat pulled low over his forehead, the brim short and frayed. His clothes hung off him like rags, oversized and stained with something dark. And even through the sealed glass, my brain almost tricked me into smelling stale alcohol and unwashed skin. But it was his eyes that locked me in place. They were this raw, infected red, not glowing or anything cinematic like that, but deeply bloodshot, the bags underneath them sagging heavily, like the flesh was melting off his cheekbones. He looked like a man who had been on a 10-day drinking bender and had just crawled out of a gutter. He raised his hand and tapped the glass again. I didn't want to engage, but I was sitting at a red light in a very expensive car, and the last thing I needed was some crazy guy scratching the paint. So I reached over and cranked the manual window handle, just rolling it down maybe an inch, barely enough to let the damp air in. Before he could even speak, I immediately put up a defensive wall, telling him in this annoyed tone that I was just a broke driver, that this wasn't my car, and that I didn't have a single dime to give him, so he shouldn't even bother asking for money. He didn't even react to my rejection. He just tilted his head, his voice raspy and bizarrely flat, and asked, "Hey brother, what time is it right now so I know the way back to my house?" It was such a specific, weirdly structured question. My brain snagged on it. Why would knowing the time help him find his house? I started to get genuinely irritated, muttering to myself about how homeless guys shouldn't be worrying about schedules, but out of pure habit, I lifted my left wrist to check my watch. Nothing. Bare skin. A wave of frustration washed over me. I realized I must have taken it off the night before and left it on my bedside table because I was so exhausted. And back then, cars like that didn't have digital dashboard clocks, so I was completely clueless. I let out a heavy sigh, turning my head back to the crack in the window to tell the guy I had forgotten my watch and couldn't help him. But when I looked out, there was no one there. The sidewalk was completely empty. The space right next to the door, where he had been standing less than 2 seconds ago, was vacant. The red light was still glaring down on the asphalt. I snapped my head left, then right, looking in the rearview mirrors, trying to spot a silhouette walking away. Nothing. It was a wide-open intersection. Unless he had literally sprinted full speed into the pitch-black tree line of the park, there was no physical way he could have vanished that fast. My stomach gave this nasty, uncomfortable lurch, but you know how the human mind works. It absolutely refuses to accept the impossible. Internal gaslighting kicked in immediately. I convinced myself that he had just ducked down quickly, Or maybe he slipped behind the trunk of the car where I couldn't see him, realized I wasn't going to give him anything, and walked off into the shadows. The light finally turned green, and I practically slammed my foot on the gas, eager to put distance between me and that creepy corner. I drove past the length of the park, approaching the very next intersection, Hai Ba Trung and Dien Bien Phu. It's a super short distance, maybe a couple of 100 yards max. The park still bordered my left side, and the darkness was still heavy. The light up ahead turned red again. I cursed under my breath, easing on the brakes, stopping the car. I was still annoyed about forgetting my watch, worrying if I was going to be late to pick up the boss, calculating the drive time in my head. I was sitting there for maybe 15 seconds, in complete silence, before I heard that exact same tapping sound. Tap, 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 echoing right next to my ear, making my blood turn to ice water as I slowly turned my head to the passenger window. It was him, the exact same guy. The filthy bucket hat, the oversized rags, the sagging, bloodshot eyes. My brain completely short-circuited. There was absolutely no way he could have beaten my car to this intersection. Even if he had sprinted at Olympic speeds, I would have seen him running down the sidewalk. Yet here he was, standing completely still, not breathing hard, not sweating, just staring at me with that dead, hollow expression. The panic started to bubble up in my throat, but it morphed instantly into this aggressive, defensive anger. A survival mechanism, I guess. I rolled the window down that same tiny crack and just snapped at him, calling him a crazy bastard, demanding to know why the hell he was following me from the last block, and what his actual problem was. I asked him where he even lived, that he needed to know the time so badly. He didn't blink. He just slowly raised a filthy, dirt-caked finger and pointed straight past my car, across my face, directly into the pitch-black void of Le Van Tam Park. "My house is right in there," he whispered, his voice slicing right through the hum of my engine. "Just tell me the time, so I know the way to go home." My breath hitched. The park. The former cemetery. He was pointing into a graveyard and calling it his house. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to roll up the window and run the red light, but I was paralyzed. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady, and lied to him again, telling him I didn't have my freaking watch, that I left it at home, and to just leave me alone. He slowly lowered his hand, staring right through me, and said, "No, you didn't. Your watch is sitting right inside that glove box." Every single muscle in my body locked up. I just stared at him. How did he know? He hadn't been inside the car. He hadn't even looked down. And then, like a physical blow to the chest, the memory hit me. Yesterday afternoon, it had poured down rain while I was waiting for my boss. My watch wasn't waterproof, and it was a cheap metal thing I cherished, so before I got out to open the door with the umbrella, I had unclasped it and shoved it deep into the passenger side glove compartment. I had completely forgotten about it. My hands were shaking violently as I leaned over, keeping my eyes glued to the crack in the window, and popped the glove box open. I reached blindly inside, my fingers brushing against old registration papers and napkins, until they closed around the cold metal band of my watch. I pulled it out, bringing it up to the dim dashboard light. It read exactly 3:15 a.m. I let out a shaky breath, turning back to the window to tell him. But he was gone. Again. Just vanished into thin air. The light turned green, and this time, I didn't care about traffic laws. I hit the accelerator hard, my tires actually squealing a bit on the pavement, fleeing from that cursed park. I was trembling, checking my mirrors obsessively, terrified I'd see that bucket hat sitting in the back seat. I tried to calm myself down, staring at the watch on my wrist. 3:15 a.m. That meant my wife had woken me up at 2:30. I was absurdly early. I still had miles to go before I reached the boss's house near Notre Dame Cathedral, but the panic was deeply rooted now. I approached the next major intersection, Nguyen Tum Kai. The streetlights were actually working here, casting a slightly more comforting glow. I stopped at the red light, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white. Then, someone shouted from the sidewalk, "Hey! Hey, buddy!" I nearly jumped out of my skin, jerking my head toward the sound. It was an old man, a newspaper vendor standing under a streetlight, organizing his stacks. He was pointing frantically at the back of my car. I cracked the window, my voice shaking, telling him I didn't want to buy any papers. He shook his head, looking at me like I was an idiot, and yelled over the engine noise that my rear passenger tire was completely flat, that I was going to ruin the expensive rims if I kept driving on it, and that I needed to pull over immediately. I felt this deep sinking dread in my gut. A flat tire. Now, of all times, I slowly pulled the car over to the curb, right beneath the shadow of some overhanging trees, and killed the engine. The silence was deafening. I stepped out, the humid air wrapping around me, and walked to the back. Sure enough, the tire was completely blown out, the rubber folded over the rim. I didn't have time to be scared anymore. I had a job to do. I popped the trunk, dragging out the heavy spare tire, the jack, and the lug wrench. I was sweating profusely, my hands slipping on the cold metal. I got the car jacked up, fitting the wrench over the first lug nut. I put my weight into it, and it groaned. But it turned. One off, then the second, the third, the fourth. They were tough, but manageable. Then I got to the fifth lug nut. It wouldn't budge. I strained against the wrench, my arms burning, but it felt like it was welded to the rim. I was breathing heavily, my vision blurring slightly from the exertion and the panic. I literally stood up, placing my foot on the handle of the wrench, using my entire body weight to bounce on it, trying to force it to crack open. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was rusted tight, or cross-threaded. I didn't know. I was standing there in the dim light, wiping grease and sweat from my forehead, feeling utterly defeated. And then, a voice floated across the empty street. "Hey, brother!" I froze. The wrench slipped from my hands, clattering onto the asphalt. I slowly looked up, peering across the wide expanse of the intersection, standing on the opposite corner, half hidden in the shadows of a closed pharmacy, was the man in the bucket hat. His oversized clothes hung limply. Even from that distance, I could feel the weight of those bleeding red eyes boring into me. "I asked you a few times already." His voice carried unnaturally well, echoing as if he were whispering directly into my ear. "Just tell me what time it is, and I'll come over there and help you fix your car." The primal terror that washed over me is something I can't even put into words. The boundary of reality just shattered. He had followed me. He was playing with me. My mind desperately tried to reject the situation. I focused intensely on the ground, my eyes locking onto a discarded, crushed cigarette butt near my shoe. I stared at the faded red logo on the paper, hyper-fixating on how dirty it was, trying to anchor myself to something, anything real, while this nightmare unfolded across the street. The fear twisted into this hysterical, blind rage. I looked up, my voice cracking, and just screamed across the empty street at him. I told him he was a homeless piece of garbage, asking how the hell he thought he could fix a luxury car, telling him to leave me the fuck alone. But I was so broken, so desperate to just make him go away, that I threw my arms up and yelled it, "It's 3:20 a.m. It's 3:20 in the morning. There. Are you happy?" The silence that followed was suffocating. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there for a long, agonizing second. And then, the corners of his mouth twitched upwards into a slow, unnatural smile. "I fixed it for you," he whispered, his voice echoing from everywhere at once. "Thanks." I blinked, and the corner was empty. He was just gone. I stood there, my chest heaving, staring at the empty sidewalk. My brain couldn't process what had just happened. Fixed it. What did he mean? Slowly, mechanically, I lowered my gaze back to the flat tire. My heart completely stopped. The lug wrench was lying on the ground where I had dropped it, but right next to it, resting perfectly upright on the asphalt in a neat little row, were 5 lug nuts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I stared at the rim of the wheel. The fifth nut, the one that had held my entire body weight without budging a millimeter, was gone. The threaded stud was completely bare, the metal perfectly clean, as if unseen. Impossibly strong fingers had just reached down and effortlessly unscrewed it while I was distracted. A wave of absolute nausea hit me. The body horror of realizing a physical, unseen force had manipulated the metal right at my feet was too much. I fell to my knees, scraping them against the road, and just started frantically pressing my palms together, bowing my head over and over to the empty street. I was babbling, practically crying, begging whatever spirit or demon was out there to forgive me. I apologized for cursing, for being arrogant, pleading that I was just a stupid driver who didn't know any better, begging it to take the time and leave me alone. I don't even remember the physical act of changing the rest of the tire. It was pure instinct, driven by raw adrenaline. I threw the flat into the trunk, tightened the nuts on the spare with trembling, frantic hands, dropped the jack, and scrambled into the driver's seat. I slammed the locks down, threw it in gear, and sped off. I blew through the next 2 red lights, constantly checking the mirrors, terrified that bucket hat would appear in my peripheral vision. I made it to the boss's house at exactly 3:55 a.m. When he finally came downstairs, sharp in his suit, he immediately noticed how pale and sweaty I was. I practically begged him to cancel the trip. I told him everything: the ghost, the asking for time, the impossible lug nut. I told him my grandmother always warned that seeing a ghost before a long journey was a death omen. He just scoffed at me. He told me I was losing my mind, that a multi-million-dollar contract didn't wait for peasant superstitions, and that if I didn't drive him right then, I was fired on the spot. I had no choice. I put the car in drive, my hands shaking violently on the wheel, and headed toward the highway. After all that, I was just a nervous wreck driving down the highway. And I swear, right as we crossed the Bindien Bridge, this massive fish truck just rear-ended us. Bam! The whole trunk was caved in like a V-shape. The car was completely dead. Wouldn't even start. My boss, in his expensive suit, literally had to stand on the side of the road and flag down a sketchy public bus to make his meeting. I had to wait for a tow truck. When I finally got home, my wife made me bathe in pomelo leaves and burn some herbs to clear the bad energy. Surprisingly, the boss didn't even dock my pay. He actually believed the ghost brought the bad luck. But man, I never drove down Hai Ba Trung at night ever again.